All right, the AP poll ballots are now public. Reece Davis, ESPN, a longtime college football reporter and anchor for the major news network, has released his top 10. You can see his top 10. You can see everybody's voted for. He has Georgia at 1, Ohio State at 2. That was a very popular 1, 2. Only a couple people had something different than that. I noticed a couple people had Oregon ranked higher than one of those teams, or someone had Oregon ranked number 1. But Reece Davis talked about a little bit about his projections for the season on a recent College Game Day podcast. He did that with Pete Thamel. They had differing opinions on who was going to be the number 1 team heading into the college football playoff. And something that's very exciting about this year is that we get to new, right? You ever seen How I Met Your Mother? It's one of my favorite comedy shows. Barney Stinson, he has all these rules. He says, new is always better, right? And I like to joke around with that. But sometimes it's true that new is better. It's not always better. We think that the 12-team college football playoff has potential to be better. But what I do know about new is exciting and new is different. And that's what you get in this 2024 college football season. We're getting to experience something that we didn't before. A regular season that is going to feature some more big matchups, with Big Ten expanding, the SEC expanding, letting in Texas and Oklahoma. What it's resulting in is more big matchups. It's going to result in more of those teams probably making a playoff. It's going to result in, is the 12-team playoff going to be competitive? Yes. Is it going to be as competitive as the 4? The 4 wasn't super competitive in most of the years, right? The Rose Bowl that Georgia played against Oklahoma, the Peach Bowl, right? Those were less common than the blowouts in the semifinal game. So I don't know quite yet how it's going to be as this month and a half long, monthish long college football playoff where there's 12 teams involved. I don't know how competitive it's going to be. I think there's definitely going to be a fair share of blowouts, but it is going to be new, and more teams are going to have a chance to bring home that trophy at the end of the day. And like I said, at the end of the day, it's a little bit more of a difficult path for Georgia. It's a more difficult path for Alabama. These teams that have been penciling themselves into college football playoffs, competing at the highest level. Well, now they've got to deal with the regular season. It's a little bit more difficult. And then when they do get to the end, it's going to take at least one more win, probably 2 more wins, to get to the end, to get to where you're fighting for that trophy. So let's talk a little bit about what Reece Davis had to say. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking about Reece Davis and his predictions. I've always a nice guy. Reece, if you remember me, if you recognize me, tip of my cap. I think he's done a really good job. He's one of my favorite media people out there. Hope that I'm one of your favorite media people out there. But I think that he does do a good job of being level-headed and talking about it. Maybe he does too good of a job of being level-headed, because something I disagreed about with him is I think he had Alabama too low in his rankings. So just previewing his top 10 heading into the season, and then I'll discuss a little bit of his college football playoff predictions. But he has Georgia 1, Ohio State 2, Texas 3, Oregon 4. It's pretty common. You ask me, I put Oregon ahead of Texas. He's got Ole Miss 5. He had Florida State at 6, Alabama at 7, Notre Dame at 8, Missouri 9, Penn State 10. That 8 through 10, pretty common. Florida State, common to be around that top 10 mark. I do think Alabama's a better team than Florida State this year. I don't think Florida State's as good as last year's Florida State team. And before those injuries, it was a team that was deserving of being in the college football playoff. You get those injuries, you get that Jordan Travis, you get that Jordan Travis season-ending injury, it's a different conversation, right? And it was a team that, to me, was a borderline top 4, even as undefeated. With the injuries, just wasn't a top 4 team, in my opinion. I think that Florida State takes a slight step back this year. I do think that Mike Norvell is one of the best coaches in college football, but I'm a little surprised that Reece Davis has him at 6, especially he's an Alabama alum, and he knows what the deal is with this Alabama team. Something that I'm noticing that is becoming a common theme is people are taking the rat poison that Nick Saban is throwing out there. And maybe Reece Davis is feeding into that a little bit when he ranks Alabama number 7. To me, Alabama has a legitimate case to be a top 5 team, has a legitimate case to be the second best team in the SEC, assuming that Georgia's number 1. I'm not 100% sold on Texas yet as having that title. Pete Thamel is, right? And that's who does this college game day podcast with Reece Davis. And Pete Thamel has Texas as the number 1 seed heading into the college football playoff. So fast forward to predictions in December, right? He thinks that Texas will win the conference. They'll be the number 1 seed. Look, most of these years, if the 12 becomes something that's more long term, obviously we're only guaranteed to have it for 2 seasons. I think they're going to end up expanding, if we're being honest. More games equals more money, equals more viewers, equals more and more and more. And we're a greedy country. We're a greedy people, and that extends to college football fans and workers, right? So as long as we have the 12, though, I just think that I just don't understand why we're already. I sidetracked myself talking about expanding to 14. I don't understand why we're already trying to expand when we haven't seen the 12. But as long as we have the 12, I think that, and probably the 14, and just whatever it ends up expanding to, the SEC Championship is probably going to be the number 1 seed heading into the college football playoff most years. Unless you get a dominant Ohio State year, a dominant Big Ten, right? Maybe, maybe an Oklahoma State has just blows everybody out and they beat an SEC team in a non-conference game. I don't know. But most of the time, I think it's going to be an SEC team that ends up being that number 1 seed. Well, Reece Davis predicts that it'll be Georgia, despite the tough schedule. I'll read a little bit of the quotes that he had from that. Pete Thamel thinks it'll be, and if you don't know who he is, he works for ESPN. He's one of their college football writers, insiders. He's gotten some more screen time over the last couple of years. He's starting to become more of a staple as someone that they put on air. He thinks it'll be Texas. I don't think it's going to be Texas. It's just my prediction. I think that Texas will be a college football playoff team. I'm just a little lower on them than the general public seems. I think they're probably more like the 5 or the 6 versus the 3 or the 4. I just think that, especially now with the injury to both of their RB1 and their RB2, we saw how much that hurt Georgia, right? Obviously, how much did it hurt Georgia when they were 13-1, Orange Bowl champions? Well, it hurt them getting into the playoff for sure. It's one of the aspects that they struggled with last year was the run game. The Texas offense is going through a lot of transition with its weapons on the outside. Yeah, I do think that losing your top 2 running backs is going to hurt your offense. And I think it's going to be tough to adjust to. That's why Reece Davis, a couple of the things he had to say. Georgia's had a much, much more difficult schedule than Texas. They have to go to Texas to play. Their schedule is difficult enough, especially the road schedule, that they can play well and lose. They don't have to show up flat necessarily because they have some challenges, but a lot of confidence in this team. Georgia's the anti-schedule pick. This is the belief that if you are good enough, you'll win the games anyway. If you're powerful enough, you'll win the games anyway. Georgia has to go to Alabama, Texas, Ole Miss, and they've got Tennessee at home. Yet I'm still defaulting to who I think the best team is. That's kind of the difference, right? It used to be Alabama, where you defaulted to, I think the best team. I think they're just going to win all these games. And now that's becoming Georgia, right? When I got to talk to Rece back in November, this was the Friday before the Ole Miss game, college game day was in town, so he was in town. We got to speak a little bit. And he said Georgia's building an unprecedented dynasty. Obviously, he said that before what transpired in the SEC Championship and Georgia not making it, but I don't think that he would go back on that statement if I had to predict. Another thing they had to say about Georgia was sort of the institutional success that Georgia's had as a football program, knowing how to win. Probably a bit of frustration from last year because Michigan proved to be the best team because Georgia wasn't in the field. For most of the season, if not all, you could easily make the argument that Georgia was the best team. And that's one of the biggest things about last year, right? That is going to get shored up with an expanded playoff. If you get into the situation like last year where someone's snubbed for it, it's just not going to happen anymore. The issue that we ran into, it felt like last year was the first time we needed an expanded playoff because, yeah, there were more than 4 teams that had an argument. And it is hard to decide who the best 4 teams are because if you're not doing it with a computer and it's a group of people, different people are going to have differing opinions, and there were all sorts of differing opinions. Some people thought Florida State deserved it. Some people thought Georgia deserved it. Some people thought they got it right with Texas and Alabama as the 3 and the 4. But at the end of the day, those arguments aren't going to matter as much. It'll just be about seeding, and we just won't have that because it's true what Reece Davis said. When you think about last season, who did everyone think was the best team for most of the year? Some people thought it was Michigan. Michigan wins the championship. Congratulations to Michigan. I don't think it would have been as easy if Georgia was in the playoff. And we do, up until they lost Alabama, they were the consensus number 1 in college football. And until they lose this year, unless they just don't look as great and Ohio State looks better, until they lose this year, that's not going to change. Why? We're human and we default to certain things. The wording that Reece Davis said, defaulting, Georgia's default is to win right now. Georgia's default right now among people's default is to assume that Georgia's number one, is to assume that Georgia has the best chances to do this and to do that. And that's bleeding into the players. You get that with Carson Beck now too, also being number one in college football odds. But I do think it was interesting to see some of the things that he had to say about heading into this college football season. Thought his top 10 was a little bit weird. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and thank you for watching.